Sorry. So I'm not much of a bettor. So well, I really like the idea of betting actually, but I'm not very into this field. So I apologize if I miss important aspects of horse racing in particular. But I want to give some background on artificial intelligence because that's really my field. And I want to really come back to the basis and trying to understand what it's really about. And based on this, we'll try to see what the perspectives are, and I'll try to discuss what are the pros and cons of artificial intelligence, like how does it compare to let's say, human intelligence. So, like, let's go back to the beginning, and really the beginning of artificial intelligence is arguably this amazing paper of Alan Turing. So I'm sure you've all heard of Alan Turing. He did a lot of amazing things in his career. He created the computing machine. He saved, well, the Allies during the World War. And one of his most amazing contributions, I would argue, is this amazing paper where he basically introduces the idea of artificial intelligence. And you have to imagine that back then, like, artificial intelligence was extremely weird, because there was no machine, really, no thinking machine, not even like a computer back then. And yet Turing really thought about this, and many of the ideas in this paper are like really ahead of his time, and arguably still ahead of his time even today. Like it's arguably like 60 or to 70 years ahead of his time. So the question that really asked Turing is, how do we get artificial intelligence? How do we get something that can think like a human, like that can behave like a human? And Turing noticed that it was going to be a difficult problem. So that's like the basic claim of Turing. It's not that self-evident, like many computer scientists thought that they would crack artificial intelligence a few years after Turing, but Turing said it's not going to be that easy. And he argued that basically the only way to get to that kind of intelligence was to basically more or less follow some, at least part of the footsteps of human intelligence. How does the brain come to be as intelligent as it is and to make the guesses it's going to make in a horse race? And so for Turing, there were three important parts to human intelligence. The first part is the so-called initial state of the mind, the brain at birth. Like the brain at birth is already something quite marvelous. It's already able to learn. Of course, it's not like smart, as we would call it today, because like it won't be able to make a lot of good guesses. Like don't ask your newborn what you should be betting on, but it already has like the key features for learning. And then there's the two other important parts, which was B and C here, which are the learning phases. And Turing identifies two different aspects of learning. The first part is education, which we would call today supervised learning. Like basically you have someone near you and tells you this is what you should do, this is what you should not do. And he also identifies a lot of other experiences that are extremely useful for learning, but even though we're not supervised, it's still a very extremely important part. And basically Turing argued that these were essential for reaching any kind of intelligence, of like human-like intelligence, but not even human-like. Like you really needed these three steps. So today, these three steps are summarized usually as follows, as in this equation. Basically, you need a so-called machine learning algorithm. You need something that's able to learn. And like I'm sure you've heard of neural networks and stuff like that. These are machine learning algorithms. But then you also need a lot of data to direct this learning. And so you both need machine learning and big data to get something like artificial intelligence. At least that was Turing's claim in 1950. And more people are starting to say that, yeah, indeed, this is what seems critical for intelligence. In particular, the key algorithm today to most artificial intelligence, especially if you're doing neural networks, is so-called stochastic gradient descent. It's extremely simple. It's crazy how simple it is. But really, it's just like you draw data, like you look at some piece of data, and then you just adjust, you tweak a little bit the parameters of your machine. So typically in a neural network, like the brain, there would be like the connections between the neurons are going to change slightly because of the data. So there are like sophisticated way to compute how it should be changed. But basically it's just adjusting the parameters so that it better fits the data. And then you just repeat these two phases. It's extremely simple. It's just you look at some data and you just adjust the parameters of your model to better match the data. And what's extremely counterintuitive is that this simple algorithm allows performances that were like very hard to predict even like 5 years ago. And this really boils down to this amazing quote of Turing, where he discusses what he calls a fallacy to which philosophers and mathematicians are particularly subject. So it's probably something worth pondering. Basically, the idea of Turing is that we tend to think that if we understand all the steps of a reasoning or all the steps of a machine, if we know what everything that the machine does, then we should be able to predict what it's going to do. This is almost trivial, like if you just do all the steps and you can then predict. But what Turing says is that this takes a lot of effort, and if there are a billion of intermediary steps, you're going to be surprised by the outcome. It's not possible for you to do all the reasoning steps, and so you will likely be surprised by the outcome. And I think this is a very important takeaway. It's extremely hard to predict the performances of an artificial intelligence these days, not because the algorithm is extremely sophisticated, but it's because it's doing a lot of very simple operations. If you think about your phones these days, or your computers, they are based on the models of Turing, which are basically just doing a lot of very simple steps. And a lot of very simple steps is sufficient to create something that's very surprising to us. If you think of AlphaGo, for instance, like this artificial intelligence that won the game of Go, or especially AlphaZero, which was an improvement on AlphaGo, its algorithm is extremely simple. But just because it's simple doesn't mean that we can predict what's going to come out of this. And in fact, if we were able to predict what AlphaZero was going to play, then we would be the best player of Go in the world. So really, I think it's an important quote in the sense that it's very hard to predict what comes out of a lot of reasoning steps. Okay, so this was an introduction to artificial intelligence. I think it's important to have this in mind, but that's not really what I want to talk about today. I think what could be very interesting for this kind of audience is how does such machines compare to the human brain? Okay, so it doesn't switch. Okay, okay. So here are like the big differences that are like arguably like every AI researchers would probably agree with all of this. What's very amazing with the human brain is that it's able to have common sense. It's something that we take for granted, but it's extremely hard to describe and to identify and to program. We have a lot of so-called background knowledge. Like there are lots of things that are so obvious to us that we all agree immediately, but it's actually very hard to really describe this common sense. And this is, so every time you have predictions that require a lot of just common sense, of background knowledge, of things that you learned or you just accustomed to, like for instance, the laws of physics. So the laws of physics, the exact laws of physics are very complicated, or not very complicated, but not very intuitive. But if you see a ball falling, like if you look at a football player, sorry, I'm more of a football player than a horse racing fan. But if you see a football player, he's able to predict, like to adjust his run to where the ball is going to fall. And this requires a lot of background knowledge because we're accustomed to this. We see a lot of balls falling, and especially these guys are trained to do this. And this is actually very, very hard to describe and to compute. So this is the kind of thing that humans will probably say better than AIs for some time. Another thing that's a consequence of this is so-called sampling complexity, which is also known as the small data regime. So we humans are very good at generalizing from a few data, from a few examples. The classical example of that is if you show to a kid an image of an animal, that he's never seen before, he's going to be very good at saying, hey, Dad, this is also the animal that you showed me yesterday. This is something that cannot be done today with AIs. Because they don't have this background knowledge that's actually critical to do this kind of generalizations. Another thing that humans are very good at, and so far like AIs don't seem very good at it, it seems to be a very difficult problem, is the theory of mind. So the theory of mind is trying to guess what the other is guessing. So or thinking in more generally. So whenever, and you can say that this is a consequence of probably like natural selection, like basically we've evolved to be adapted to our environment, and like much of our environment is social interaction, so we're very good at social interaction. And what social interactions require is basically understanding what the other is thinking or what he wants. And so the human brain is sort of optimized for this kind of interactions. So we're very good like analyzing what's going on in someone else's mind, much better than AIs. And another thing that we're doing amazingly well compared to AIs is cross-data processing. We are very good at using all the different kinds of data. So if you're thinking about how people bet, well, probably they're going to use a lot of images of horse racing, a lot of like raw data, basically the ranking of the different horses. But also probably we're going to read a lot of articles, of reports, and we're going to cross all of this data in a way that so far, as far as I know at least, AIs are not very good at. So that are the pros of the humans against AIs. But of course, AIs is very good at other things, at things that we're not very good at, like big data processing. Well, basically, these days, if you look at like some of the statistics, if you have billions of statistics of data, well, for a human to go through a billion data, well, it takes decades if you're doing one data at a second. So it's really, there's like no comparison in terms of data processing capability. Plus, what's more, like the AI is doing this extremely fast. So there's this idea of fast processing. So if you have to be like real time and adjust a lot of things to a lot of incoming data, well, AIs are doing this very well. And that's why, for instance, if you're thinking about like the big applications of AI these days is like recommendation systems. Like recommendation systems is like really this problem of fast processing. You need to process a lot of data. Another thing that AIs are doing well, actually, it's more like the humans are not doing that well, is facing cognitive biases. So you probably know that, like, I don't know if you know it, but there is a huge literature these days in psychological literature about the fact that the human brain has a lot of these recurrent flaws in the way we do our reasoning. So for instance, there's a cognitive ease. We tend to prefer things that are very familiar to us. For instance, there's availability bias. We tend to give too much importance that's what's on our mind right now. If we thought longer, then we wouldn't give that much importance to this. And this arguably causes us to take sometimes wrong decisions, while AIs won't be making such errors. Also, AIs are never exhausted. Like they don't drink, they don't sleep. They do this 24/7. They're very good at that. And another thing is like probability theory. Well, AIs are not that good, actually, I would argue, in probability theory. But the human brain is not that good either. It's probably even worse. Like there are very basic problems, like for instance, the Monty Hall problem is like a very classic problem in probability theory. And it was one posed to Paul Erdős, who's one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. And like it's really like a three-line puzzle, and Erdős got it wrong. So even like the greatest mathematicians are not intuitive, at least not intuitively good at probability theory. So, and AIs, well, they probably won't make such like blatant mistakes. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so these are the differences. So I don't know where I should point out. Okay. So these are the differences. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not extremely familiar with horse racing, but I want to give the example of friends of mine who've done like predictions using an AI during the World Cup. So that was the game between Brazil and Belgium. So you see the bottom line, it's not very big, but basically the AI is giving different probabilities to the different, to Brazil winning or Belgium winning or for it to be a draw. And so it's an AI, like apparently it's a very good AI, like it's beaten many others AIs. It was a good AI. It's interesting to wonder how these kind of AIs work, to see what are the strengths and weaknesses. In particular, what this AI does is basically it looks only at results of previous games. It doesn't look at reports. It doesn't look at the number of opportunities of the previous games. It doesn't even look at who is playing. So it's interesting because this shows that if there's this kind of event, like for instance, there's a game of Brazil, and like for some reason, like last minute reason, you may know that Neymar is not going to play. then we humans will quickly update our beliefs. Like we're going to say, oh, then it's less likely for Brazil to win. But these kinds of AIs, usually it's very hard to integrate that, and like most AIs will not be able to know what to do with this information, and probably they will be doing no update. So probably this is something to take in mind. Like AIs rely on data as well, and there are some data that cannot process as well as us, at least. And so, like humans could be better than AIs for these kinds of tasks. So, like one of the frontier today of machine learning, is try to get them to learn common sense, which is a very difficult task. But I want to discuss the fact that this might not last for that long. Like there are like important progresses in giving in this effort to give AI some common sense. In particular, like identifying a cat in an image. Like it seems like this kind of task is so trivial to us. Like we see a cat, we know it's a cat. But it's taken a while for AI researchers to manage this. It's actually a very hard AI problem. It's not the hardest, but it took years to get this, and now we can do this. Probably what's even weirder, and like it's an example that I really like, is that now like there has been an AI who's been trained to learn to read text. It's read a lot of text, and then like we could ask this AI in some way, what would be the result of an operation like you take a king and you do minus a man and then plus a woman. And for humans, it's like obvious that it's going to be a queen. Like if you take a king minus man plus woman, then you should get a queen. And for a long time, for an AI to do this, it was like completely crazy. But now we can do this. So there are important progresses along these lines as well. And like many other amazing things, like for instance, there's an AI, you give it an image of a person and you ask, what would this person look like if I gave him glasses? And we humans are very good at imagining, well, if you have glasses, well, just add a few glasses. It turns out that it was very difficult for AIs to do this, but now we can do this with the AI, which shows that AIs are already progressing. And the progress in AI is quite fast these days. So what is missing in AI? So if we try to project ourselves to maybe like a decade or like very like much further in the future, what is missing for AI to reach human levels? Can they reach human levels? Well, you know that Turing argued, I don't know if you know it, but Turing argued in 1950 that the answer would be yes. And he argued that the key thing would be to gain complexity. If you think about the complexity of the brain has 10 to the 15 synapses, so a million billions. Turing argued that this should be compared with the sizes of our models, of our neural networks, number of parameters of our models. And these days, the biggest AIs have usually like gigabytes, like maybe tens of gigabytes, maybe 100 gigabytes, but not much more, which is like a billion or 100 billions. And we need, Turing argued that we needed to get to a million billion of complexity to reach human level. And so we're really not there yet, but like if you follow Turing's argument, like it's just a matter of increasing the complexity of algorithms. And this also requires a lot of data. Basically, the number of data required is going to be, let's say, proportional to the number of the complexity of the model. So we need like a million billion data to get to this point. And so if we, like, as technology progresses, probably we're going to be able to do this more and more. And so, yeah, this is like a thought that that argues that, yeah, perhaps when they reach this, like, well, when, it's hard to predict, but maybe they'll be able to reach human level. Now, having said this, AIs will always have limits. So there are computational limits that have been studied by computer scientists related to the P versus NP problem. But basically, data processing is still hard, even if you're very good. Like, there's still like fundamental limits. And the other thing, which is very important and much easier to control in some sense, is the access to data. Really, if an AI does not have data, it will not be able to make good predictions, just like a human. So access to data is really critical to get very efficient AIs. And just to conclude, so I recently wrote a book trying to like, it didn't start with these premises. It started more with the premises of probability theory, but it did discuss a lot of aspects of complexity and stuff like that. And basically, this book is trying to found the knowledge and on like all of knowledge, all of thinking, like ideal thinking, into a framework. And so arguably, if you believe this book, if you believe this line of thinking, which is called Bayesian thinking, then basically learning and knowledge is all a matter of computation in the end, and like processing the data to get to a conclusion. And in this sense, like there doesn't seem to be a fundamental limit to at least AIs reaching human level intelligence. Okay, that's what I will argue. Okay, so this concludes the talk. I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for breaking down what is obviously a very complex but fascinating subject. Is there any questions from the floor for Lei? If I could just throw you the box. You ready to catch? Yep. There we go. Oh. We got there.
Hi. Yeah. Yes, you tell us that Google beats the Go game. So what is the process to beat the Go games, and I can use the same process to beat the next Arc de Triomphe race on Sunday?
So it's an interesting question. I think so far AIs are also very bad at multitasking. Like they're really designed for specific purposes, and it's very hard to immediately adapt an AI to another task. And so these days, it seems like, well, from my experience at least, you really need a lot of expertise to adapt the basic ideas of some AI to a specific field. So you cannot just like that create an AI that's going to be immediately able to predict the horse racing. Having said that, this, of course, like there are ideas from this AI that can be reused, and people do this a lot. It's not always easy, but this can be done usually. Use ideas from one field to apply them to another field.
And if you can tell us the winner of Sunday's Arc, that would be great. Thank you. Any other questions? Anyone else from the floor? We have one over here. Can you perhaps throw the box over to the middle, and then we'll throw it again across the room? There we go, yeah. Thank you very much for your assistance. And again, another good throw. Ah, very good. If you can speak into the box.
Yeah. AI has the various factor, the various sector, for example, on GAN and machine learning and the reinforcement. We wish to predict the horse racing, which one is winner or second. So what do you think of the sophisticated sector of the AI? So promoted the winner, predicting the winner. So
I'm not sure I understand the question.
When the AI has the various factor or the sector of the data. So for example, GAN, and this GAN has a this GAN and Q GAN has, and reinforcement. And so what kind of the sector, what kind of the sector is we promoted that the AI can AI predict the winner, sometimes predict the winner.
So like I think that there are predictions problems that are not cannot be done deterministically, not because you lack intelligence, but because you lack data. Like there's this famous quote of Laplace who said, like, if you knew all the positions of all of the particles in the universe, then you could predict all of the future, and like there would be no ignorance. But in practice, you cannot measure the positions of all the particles, and in fact, there's like things like chaos theory that shows that if you just missed one particle, it's going to completely upset your prediction. So yeah, I think I strongly believe that you cannot make deterministic predictions. It's all about getting like these probabilities to better describe your ignorance in some sense.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much once again to Lei, Ngo and Hoang for a fascinating talk, and a round of applause, please.